By the time the man finally walked back into Harlem, 11 years had passed, and every single one of them had been borrowed time. The rain was coming down hard that night, slicking Lenox Avenue into a black ribbon of reflection and regret. Neon lights buzzed and flickered like tired witnesses. A man in a tailored gray overcoat stepped out of a taxi and paused on the curb, breathing in air that hadn't belonged to him in over a decade. Harlem had changed, but not enough to forget. He thought time had done what distance couldn't. He thought prison, aging, and silence had erased old debts. He thought Bumpy Johnson was either softened or gone. He was wrong. Inside the Savoy-adjacent restaurant on 140th, men sat at small round tables, their voices low, their movements deliberate. This wasn't just a place to eat. It was neutral ground. A room where reputations entered before bodies did. And at table 7, seated perfectly upright, napkin folded with care, sat the man Harlem still referred to as Mr. Johnson. Bumpy didn't look up when the door opened. He didn't need to. The room shifted anyway. Forks slowed. Conversations thinned. Someone near the back stopped mid-laugh as if he'd been reminded of a funeral. Because in Harlem, when a ghost walked in breathing, it meant history was about to collect interest. The man hesitated. Just a fraction. Long enough to tell on himself. 11 years ago, he'd crossed Bumpy Johnson in a way men didn't survive twice. He'd taken money that wasn't his, whispered things that didn't belong to him, and disappeared when the consequences came due. He told himself he'd been young. He told himself it was business. He told himself Bumpy had bigger wars to fight. What he never told himself, what no one ever told him, was that Bumpy Johnson never forgot a ledger. Especially not one written in betrayal. The man straightened his coat and walked toward table 7. Only then did Bumpy Johnson lift his eyes. They were calm, almost polite, but behind them sat something colder than anger. Memory. And in that instant, the man understood the truth Harlem had always known. Time didn't save you from Bumpy Johnson. It only made the reckoning quieter. Long before that night, before the rain and the silence in table 7, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had already become something Harlem didn't have language for. He wasn't just feared. He was understood. By the late 1930s, Harlem was a city inside a city. Brilliant, bruised, alive with music and struggle, ambition and blood. Jazz poured out of basements and ballrooms. Black businessmen fought for inches of dignity, while white power structures tried to fence them into corners. And in between those worlds walked Bumpy Johnson, bow-tied, sharp-eyed, operating by a code most men pretended not to see. He wasn't the loudest in the room. He wasn't the quickest to threaten. But when Bumpy Johnson spoke, Harlem leaned in. He controlled numbers, protection, favors, and peace, often in that order. He negotiated with Italian mobsters who underestimated him once and never again. He sat across from politicians who smiled in public and trembled in private. He kept violence contained not because he loved power, but because he understood chaos was bad for business and worse for his people. That's what set him apart. Bumpy Johnson didn't just run Harlem. He protected it, in his own way. Which made betrayal something else entirely. The man who would one day stand at table 7 had once been inside Bumpy's orbit. Not family, not blood, but trusted enough to handle money, messages, and movement. Trusted enough to know routes, names, and timing. Trusted enough to be dangerous. And like many men before him, he mistook proximity for equality. When pressure came, from rivals, from law enforcement, from the weight of easy money, he folded. He skimmed. He spoke sideways. He made choices that benefited himself and endangered others. And when the net began to tighten, he ran, disappeared into another city, another name, another life. For a while it worked. Bumpy Johnson went to prison, then out, then back again. The streets shifted, new faces rose, old ones fell. The man watched from a distance, telling himself the chapter had closed. But Harlem doesn't close chapters like that. It waits. By the time the man returned, older and thinner, convinced he could blend into a changed world, Bumpy Johnson had already reclaimed his seat. Older, too. Wiser. Sharper in ways time couldn't dull. And when word reached Bumpy that he was back, the one who thought years could erase a line crossed long ago, Bumpy didn't send for him, didn't threaten, didn't rush. He simply chose a table. Because legends don't chase ghosts. They let ghosts walk back in on their own. And when they do, the past finally gets to speak. The man stood now just a few steps from table 7, rain still clinging to his coat, confidence leaking through the seams. Bumpy Johnson met his eyes, expression unreadable. The waiter froze. So did the room. Because everyone there understood something the man was only beginning to grasp. This wasn't a meeting. This was a reckoning that had been waiting 11 years to begin. Bumpy Johnson didn't invite the man to sit. That was the first message. The second came in the form of silence, thick, deliberate, and heavy enough to bend the air between them. The man stood there, hat in hand, rainwater darkening the carpet beneath his shoes, waiting for permission that never came. Finally, Bumpy spoke. 11 years, he said calmly, his voice smooth but firm, like a door closing without a slam. That's a long time to be gone. The man swallowed. I heard you were away, he replied, careful with every word. Figured things had changed. Bumpy tilted his head just slightly, studying him, not as a threat, not as an equal, but as a piece of history that had wandered back out of its grave. Around them, no one pretended not to listen. This was Harlem courtroom now. Things always change, Bumpy said, but debts don't. A chair scraped softly as one of Bumpy's men shifted position, not reaching, not posturing, just reminding the room that Bumpy Johnson never sat alone. The man forced a small smile. I came back clean. I'm not in nobody's way. That earned him Bumpy's full attention. Bumpy folded his napkin with care and placed it beside his plate. You ever notice, he said, how men who say they're not in the way are usually standing right in it? A few men at nearby tables nodded without realizing they were doing it. The man hesitated, then made his mistake. I paid my price, he said. I lost years, lost everything. Bumpy's eyes hardened, not with rage, but with clarity. No, Bumpy replied. You avoided your price. There's a difference. The tension thickened. This wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but every man in that room knew something irreversible had begun. To understand why this moment mattered, why Harlem itself seemed to lean closer, you had to understand what betrayal meant in Bumpy Johnson's world. This wasn't about pride. It wasn't about ego. It was about order. In a neighborhood where official justice rarely arrived on time, or at all, order was currency. Loyalty was structure. Trust kept the streets from tearing themselves apart. The man standing at table 7 hadn't just stolen money. He had disrupted balance. Years earlier, when he skimmed from collections meant to keep peace between rival operators, it triggered suspicion. When he whispered names to outsiders, it brought heat down on men who had done nothing but honor their word. When he disappeared, he left others to absorb the consequences. 2 men went away because of information that never should have traveled. One business folded under pressure it shouldn't have faced. And Bumpy Johnson, who took responsibility whether it belonged to him or not, had been forced to tighten the streets in ways Harlem still remembered. And now this man stood here talking about time served. Time didn't serve justice. Men did. I ain't looking for trouble, the man said, lowering his voice. I just want to live. Bumpy leaned back in his chair. That's the funny thing, he said. Everybody wants to live. Question is, who you willing to let pay for it? The man looked around, finally noticing the stillness. The way waiters hadn't moved. The way no one ate. He realized, too late, that this wasn't a private conversation. This was instruction. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just speaking to him. He was reminding Harlem how memory worked. You took something, Bumpy continued. Something that didn't belong to you. Then you ran and let time do the talking. Now you're back, thinking years change meanings. He paused. They don't. The man's confidence cracked. What do you want from me? That question, simple, desperate, carried more weight than the man understood. Because asking what Bumpy Johnson wanted meant admitting Bumpy Johnson decided. Bumpy studied him a long moment before answering. I want you to understand something, he said. You standing here because I allowed it. You breathing because I chose patience over speed. The man's eyes flickered. That patience, Bumpy went on, has limits. The challenge wasn't loud. It wasn't a raised voice or a slammed fist. It was the man's assumption that he could return without consequence. And in Bumpy Johnson's world, assumptions got men buried, or worse, forgotten. I can make it right, the man said quickly. I'll pay, whatever I owe. Bumpy shook his head slowly. Money's the cheapest apology there is, he said. If it bought forgiveness, the streets would be saints. Another pause, longer this time. Tell me, Bumpy said, where were you when men had to answer for your absence? The man opened his mouth, closed it. There was no answer that didn't indict him. That was the moment the room understood this wasn't about punishment. It was about reckoning. Bumpy Johnson stood, not abruptly, not with threat, but with finality. The chair slid back cleanly, like it had rehearsed the move. When a man crosses a line, Bumpy said, time don't erase it. It just gives him room to forget. He stepped closer now, close enough that only the man could hear the rest. I never forgot. The man's breath quickened. For the first time since he'd walked through that door, he understood the truth Harlem had carried quietly for 11 years. Bumpy Johnson hadn't been waiting to find him. He'd been waiting to face him. And what came next wouldn't be loud. It would be precise. Bumpy turned slightly, signaling one of his men, not with a gesture, but with a look. The restaurant remained frozen, every soul aware that the calm had reached its edge. The confrontation was about to move from words to consequence, and Harlem was watching. The look Bumpy Johnson gave wasn't sharp. It didn't cut. It measured. The kind of look a man gives when he's already decided the outcome and is simply observing how the other person carries himself toward it. One of Bumpy's men, Big Walt, shifted subtly near the wall, not blocking exits, not posturing. Just present. Just undeniable. The man noticed. He glanced toward the door, then back to Bumpy. That ain't necessary, he said, forcing calm into his voice. We can talk. Bumpy nodded once. That's what we doin'. But the words didn't land the way the man hoped. They weren't an invitation. They were a reminder of control. Bumpy motioned to the empty chair across from him. Slow, deliberate. Sit. The man hesitated, then obeyed. Chairs only scraped when people didn't know the rules. He eased himself down, spine stiff, hands folded too tightly in his lap. Now they were eye level. Now there was no distance to hide in. You remember the winter of '44? Bumpy asked. The man blinked. It was cold. Bumpy smiled faintly, not amused, not angry, just acknowledging the memory. Cold enough men talked when they shouldn't. The man's jaw tightened. That winter, Bumpy continued, 3 routes got crossed. Money came up light. Names ended up in places they didn't belong. He leaned forward slightly. You were holding 2 of those routes. Silence. Not denial, not confusion. Recognition. I was under pressure, the man said finally. Everybody was. Bumpy nodded. Pressure don't change character. It reveals it. That landed heavier than any accusation. You took what wasn't yours, Bumpy said. Then you let other men stand in front of the storm you caused. The man's voice dropped. I didn't think it would go that far. Bumpy's eyes hardened. That's the problem with thinking after the fact, he said. It don't undo nothing. Around them, Harlem absorbed every word. This wasn't gossip. This was record-keeping. The challenge wasn't whether the man had betrayed Bumpy Johnson. That much was settled. The real challenge was what justice looked like 11 years later. Bumpy Johnson understood time better than most. Prison had taught him patience. Harlem had taught him restraint. He knew that power wasn't proven by how fast you struck, but by how cleanly you finished. The man shifted in his seat. "I can still be useful," he said. "I know things. I got contacts outside the neighborhood." Bumpy studied him, then leaned back. "That's the same thing you said back then," he replied. "Right before you decided usefulness was worth more than loyalty." The man's shoulders slumped. This wasn't negotiation anymore. This was autopsy. "You ever wonder why nobody came looking for you?" Bumpy asked. The man frowned. "I stayed quiet." Bumpy shook his head. "No, you weren't worth the noise." That one stung, not because it threatened, but because it diminished. "In Harlem," Bumpy continued, "we don't chase what's already running scared." The man swallowed. "Then why now?" That was the question that mattered. Bumpy leaned forward again, voice low but steady. "Because you came back." A pause. "You walked into a place where memory lives," Bumpy said. "You don't get to pretend it forgot you." Outside, the rain continued to fall, tapping the windows like an impatient clock. Inside, time felt suspended, caught between what had been done and what was about to be decided. The man exhaled slowly. "So what happens now?" Bumpy didn't answer right away. He glanced around the room, at the men who kept order, at the younger faces learning how power actually worked, at the older ones who remembered when mistakes were paid for immediately. This wasn't just about one man. It was about instruction. "You gonna make something right," Bumpy said finally. "Not with money." The man looked up, hope flickering briefly. "Then how?" Bumpy's voice remained even. "You gonna carry what you left behind?" The man frowned. "I don't understand." "You will," Bumpy said. He stood again, signaling the end of the conversation, for now. The chair slid back. The room exhaled slightly, but didn't relax. "You thought time saved you," Bumpy said, looking down at him. "What it really did was give you room to come back and face what you owe." The man stood slowly, legs unsteady. "What if I say no?" he asked. That question, small, defiant, hung in the air. Bumpy turned fully toward him. "Then you'll leave the same way you came," Bumpy said. "Empty-handed, unprotected, and known." The man understood that word immediately. Known meant visible. Visible meant vulnerable. And vulnerable in Harlem was a short condition. He nodded once. "Good," Bumpy said. "Then we understand each other." As Bumpy turned and walked toward the back of the restaurant, men parted instinctively, not out of fear, but respect. The man remained standing by the table, alone, surrounded by witnesses and memory. He had crossed Bumpy Johnson once. He had spent 11 years believing distance was mercy. Now he knew better, because the real test hadn't even begun yet. This was just the moment the legend decided how justice would arrive. And when Bumpy Johnson decided something, Harlem adjusted accordingly. They didn't touch him when they let him out. That was deliberate. Two of Bumpy Johnson's men walked on either side, close enough to guide, far enough to remind him this wasn't force. This was direction. The rain had eased into a mist, Harlem's streets shining under street lamps like polished stone. Cars rolled by slow, curious, respectful. The man felt every eye. He'd imagined consequences before, sharp, immediate, violent. What he hadn't imagined was this quiet procession through a neighborhood that remembered him better than he remembered himself. They stopped outside a brownstone just off 137th. Modest, clean, ordinary enough that it didn't announce importance. But importance didn't need announcing here. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and old wood. The walls carried photographs, boxers, musicians, church leaders, community gatherings. Harlem history framed in black and white. Bumpy Johnson stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back, watching the street like a man who had already outlived every threat it could offer. "Close the door," Bumpy said without turning. It closed softly. The man stood in the middle of the room, suddenly aware that this wasn't neutral ground anymore. This was Bumpy's space, his rules, his memory. "You know why you're here," Bumpy said. "I said I'd make it right," the man replied. "I meant it." Bumpy turned then, finally facing him fully. Up close, the legend wasn't intimidating in the way stories suggested. No raised voice, no exaggerated menace. Just presence, settled, immovable. "You gonna make it right," Bumpy said, "by doing what you should have done 11 years ago." The man frowned. "I don't follow." Bumpy gestured toward a chair. The man sat. "There were 2 men who paid for your decisions," Bumpy said. "You remember their names?" The man shifted uncomfortably. You remember," Bumpy interrupted. "Say them." A beat. "Eddie Lawson," the man said quietly, "and Calvin Moore." Bumpy nodded once. "Eddie's mother still lives on 129th. Calvin's boy just started high school." The man looked up, startled. "You kept track?" "I keep track of what matters," Bumpy replied. Silence filled the room again, heavier now. "You don't get to erase 11 years, Bumpy continued, "but you do get to answer for them." The man's voice cracked slightly. "What do you want me to do?" Bumpy leaned forward, resting his hands on the table between them. "You gonna step back into the street," he said. "Not as a player, not as a partner, as a fix." The man blinked. "Fix what?" Bumpy's gaze sharpened. "You gonna walk into every place your name caused damage," he said. "You gonna explain. You gonna restore what can be restored. You gonna stand where others stood because you didn't." "That'll take time," the man said. Bumpy nodded. "Good. You owe time." This was the confrontation, but not the kind men expected. No shouting, no fists, no final threat spoken in anger. This was something worse. Responsibility. Bumpy Johnson understood that fear faded, pain healed. But accountability stayed with a man, followed him into rooms, sat with him at night. "You'll start tomorrow," Bumpy said. "You'll go where you're told, say what you're told. And when people look at you, you won't look away." The man's breathing grew shallow. "And when it's done?" Bumpy studied him carefully before answering. "When it's done," he said, "we'll see what kind of man you became while you were running." A long pause. "And if I refuse?" the man asked. Bumpy straightened. "Then this conversation ends," he said, "and another one starts, one you won't like." That was the only threat in the room, and it didn't need volume. The man nodded slowly. "I'll do it." Bumpy watched him for a moment longer, then gave a single nod of his own. "Good," he said. "Then you'll leave here knowing something most men never learn." "What's that?" the man asked. Bumpy's voice lowered. "Justice don't always come fast, but it always comes complete." Over the next weeks, Harlem watched something unusual unfold. The man who had vanished returned, not in triumph, not in defiance, but in service. He walked streets he once avoided, knocked on doors he once helped in danger, spoke names he'd hoped to forget. He apologized where apologies mattered. He paid where payment helped. He stood silent where silence was deserved. And everywhere he went, people understood the message without it being spoken. Bumpy Johnson was watching. Not hovering, not interfering. Watching. And that mattered more than any escort. Some accepted what the man offered. Some didn't. Bumpy didn't force forgiveness. That wasn't justice, that was control. What he enforced was reckoning. One afternoon, weeks later, the man stood outside Eddie Lawson's mother's apartment. He hesitated longer than he should have. The door opened anyway. She looked at him, recognized him, said nothing. He lowered his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said. She studied him a long moment, then stepped aside and let him in. That night, word spread quietly through Harlem. Not as rumor, but as understanding. This wasn't revenge. This was balance being restored. When the man returned to the brownstone for the final time, months later, he looked different. Thinner, straighter, less certain, but more honest. Bumpy Johnson listened as he reported what he'd done, who he'd spoken to, what remained unresolved. When he finished, Bumpy nodded. "You did what you could," he said. The man exhaled, tension leaving his shoulders. "So, are we finished?" Bumpy stood. "We are," he said. The man waited, for a warning, a condition, something else. Bumpy extended his hand instead. The man hesitated, then shook it. "Don't confuse mercy with forgetting," Bumpy said calmly. "You're free because you carried what you owed, not because time passed." The man nodded. He understood now. As he left, Bumpy returned to the window, watching Harlem move as it always had, imperfect, proud, alive. He hadn't raised his voice, he hadn't spilled blood, but the message had traveled farther than violence ever could. In Harlem, justice didn't rush, it arrived. The streets noticed first, they always did. Harlem had a way of sensing when the balance shifted, when something unfinished finally found its ending. No headlines marked it, no sirens announced it, but conversations softened, shoulders eased. Men who had once spoken in half-sentences now finished their thoughts. Justice had settled in. The man who once believed time could erase betrayal now walked Harlem differently. Not feared, not hunted, just placed, exactly where his actions had earned him. He was no longer invisible, but he wasn't powerful either. And that was the point. Bumpy Johnson never needed to destroy a man to make a lesson permanent. He understood something deeper. Consequences that left a man standing forced him to live with what he'd done. Forced him to wake up every morning knowing exactly who he was. That kind of justice lasted. In barbershops, men spoke about it quietly. "You hear what Mr. Johnson did?" someone would ask, lowering his voice. "Didn't touch him," another replied. "Made him fix what he broke." Heads nodded, because everyone understood what that meant. Bumpy Johnson had redefined power again, without spectacle, without cruelty. He reminded Harlem that authority didn't come from fear alone. It came from fairness backed by memory. And memory was something Bumpy had in abundance. The man learned quickly that consequences didn't end when the task was done. Doors didn't slam in his face anymore, but they didn't open easily either. Trust, once fractured, didn't rush back. And Bumpy never interfered with that part. "You earn forgiveness from the people," he'd said. "Not from me." Some nights the man sat alone in his apartment, replaying moments he'd once dismissed. Names he'd nearly forgotten now had weight. Faces returned in quiet detail. Time hadn't softened them. It had sharpened them. And for the first time, he understood why Bumpy Johnson had let the years pass. Speed would have ended him. Time had educated him. For Bumpy, the consequence reached further than one man. Other operators took note. Younger men, ambitious, impatient, watched carefully. They saw something they hadn't expected. Restraint enforced with absolute authority. "When it's done," he said, "we'll see what kind of man you became while you were running." A long pause. "And if I refuse?" the man asked. Bumpy straightened. "Then this conversation ends," he said, "and another one starts. One you won't like." That was the only threat in the room, and it didn't need volume. The man nodded slowly. "I'll do it." Bumpy watched him for a moment longer, then gave a single nod of his own. "Good," he said. "Then you'll leave here knowing something most men never learn." "What's that?" the man asked. Bumpy's voice lowered. "Justice don't always come fast, but it always comes complete." Over the next weeks, Harlem watched something unusual unfold. The man who had vanished returned, not in triumph, not in defiance, but in service. He walked streets he once avoided, knocked on doors he once helped in danger, spoke names he'd hoped to forget. He apologized where apologies mattered. He paid where payment helped. He stood silent where silence was deserved. And everywhere he went, people understood the message without it being spoken. Bumpy Johnson was watching. Not hovering, not interfering. Watching. And that mattered more than any escort. Some accepted what the man offered, some didn't. Bumpy didn't force forgiveness. That wasn't justice. That was control. What he enforced was reckoning. One afternoon, weeks later, the man stood outside Eddie Lawson's mother's apartment. He hesitated longer than he should have. The door opened anyway. She looked at him, recognized him, said nothing. He lowered his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said. She studied him a long moment, then stepped aside and let him in. That night, word spread quietly through Harlem, not as rumor, but as understanding. This wasn't revenge. This was balance being restored. When the man returned to the brownstone for the final time, months later, he looked different. Thinner, straighter. Less certain, but more honest. Bumpy Johnson listened as he reported what he'd done, who he'd spoken to, what remained unresolved. When he finished, Bumpy nodded. "You did what you could," he said. The man exhaled, tension leaving his shoulders. "So, are we finished?" Bumpy stood. "We are," he said. The man waited, for a warning, a condition, something else. Bumpy extended his hand instead. The man hesitated, then shook it. "Don't confuse mercy with forgetting," Bumpy said calmly. "You're free because you carried what you owed, not because time passed." The man nodded. He understood now. As he left, Bumpy returned to the window, watching Harlem move as it always had, imperfect, proud, alive. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't spilled blood. But the message had traveled farther than violence ever could. In Harlem, justice didn't rush. It arrived. The streets noticed first. They always did. Harlem had a way of sensing when the balance shifted, when something unfinished finally found its ending. No headlines marked it. No sirens announced it. But conversations softened, shoulders eased. Men who had once spoken in half sentences now finished their thoughts. Justice had settled in. The man who once believed time could erase betrayal now walked Harlem differently. Not feared, not hunted, just placed, exactly where his actions had earned him. He was no longer invisible, but he wasn't powerful either. And that was the point. Bumpy Johnson never needed to destroy a man to make a lesson permanent. He understood something deeper. Consequences that left a man standing forced him to live with what he'd done. Forced him to wake up every morning knowing exactly who he was. That kind of justice lasted. In barbershops, men spoke about it quietly. "You hear what Mr. Johnson did?" someone would ask, lowering his voice. "Didn't touch him," another replied. "Made him fix what he broke." Heads nodded, because everyone understood what that meant. Bumpy Johnson had redefined power again, without spectacle, without cruelty. He reminded Harlem that authority didn't come from fear alone. It came from fairness, backed by memory. And memory was something Bumpy had in abundance. The man learned quickly that consequences didn't end when the task was done. Doors didn't slam in his face anymore, but they didn't open easily either. Trust, once fractured, didn't rush back. And Bumpy never interfered with that part. "You earn forgiveness from the people," he'd said, "not from me." Some nights the man sat alone in his apartment, replaying moments he'd once dismissed. Names he'd nearly forgotten now had weight. Faces returned in quiet detail. Time hadn't softened them. It had sharpened them. And for the first time, he understood why Bumpy Johnson had let the years pass. Speed would have ended him. Time had educated him. For Bumpy, the consequence reached further than one man. Other operators took note. Younger men, ambitious, impatient, watched carefully. They saw something they hadn't expected. Restraint enforced with absolute authority. A young runner once asked one of Bumpy's lieutenants, why he let that man live. The answer came simple and firm. Because living with your choices is heavier than dying for them. That sentence traveled. Soon, loyalty tightened. Not because men feared sudden retaliation, but because they understood the system was patient, observant, and final. Crossing Bumpy Johnson no longer meant chaos. It meant accountability. Law enforcement noticed too. They always did when Harlem grew quieter without becoming submissive. A precinct captain once remarked, half joking, "It's strange, things settle themselves when Johnson's around." Another officer didn't laugh. "That's not strange," he said. "That's structure." They never put it in reports, never said his name officially. But they adjusted their expectations. Because when Bumpy Johnson decided something was finished, it stayed finished. One evening, weeks after the reckoning concluded, Bumpy sat in a small back room with a few trusted men. Cards lay untouched on the table. No one was in a hurry. Big Walt spoke first. "Some folks think you went easy." Bumpy smiled faintly. "Folks always think that." "You worry they'll test it?" another man asked. Bumpy shook his head. "No." "Why not?" "Because they saw the whole thing," Bumpy replied. "Not just the end." He leaned back, eyes thoughtful. "Anybody can punish," he continued. "Few men can teach." The room fell silent. That was the difference. The man crossed paths with Bumpy once more, months later, on the street near 125th. No meeting, no arrangement, just coincidence. He stopped instinctively. Bumpy nodded once as he passed. Nothing more. That nod carried more meaning than any threat ever could. It said, "You were seen. You were measured. You were finished." The man exhaled only after Bumpy was gone. Harlem absorbed the story the way it absorbed all truths, slowly, thoroughly, permanently. No one bragged about it, no one dramatized it, but the lessons settled into the bones of the neighborhood. Time didn't erase betrayal. Distance didn't dilute responsibility. And power, real power, didn't need to shout. Bumpy Johnson had delivered justice without blood, without spectacle, without apology. And that made it heavier than violence ever could be. The consequence wasn't fear. It was clarity. Men understood where lines were drawn. Understood that crossing them didn't invite chaos. It invited something worse. A reckoning that waited. And always arrived complete. Years later, when men spoke about Bumpy Johnson, they didn't always start with the violence. They talked about moments like that one. The quiet ones. The controlled ones. The times when power revealed itself not through destruction, but through discipline. In Harlem, legends weren't measured by body counts. They were measured by what stayed standing after a storm. And after that reckoning, after the man who thought time would save him learned what patience really meant, Harlem stood a little straighter. Bumpy Johnson's reputation didn't grow louder. It grew deeper. You could feel it in how disputes cooled before they flared, in how young men listened more than they spoke, in how outsiders approached Harlem with a different tone, less arrogance, more caution. They understood something essential. Bumpy Johnson wasn't impulsive. He wasn't reactive. He was final. That made him dangerous in a way few men ever were. The story spread beyond Harlem too, not as gossip, but as example. Italian operators downtown took note. They had always respected Bumpy, but now they understood him better. This wasn't a man who needed to flex dominance. This was a man who could wait a decade, then resolve a problem without shaking the streets. One of them reportedly said, "That's not a gangster, that's a judge." And in Harlem, that wasn't an insult. It was recognition. The man at the center of it all faded into normal life. That was his sentence. No comeback. No redemption arc celebrated in whispers. Just existence. Honest, quiet, accountable. He worked. He paid. He stayed visible enough to be remembered, small enough not to matter. And that was mercy. Because Bumpy Johnson understood something few men in power ever did. Erasure was easy. Correction was harder. but correction changed the future. As the years passed, Harlem changed again, as it always did. New music, new faces, new pressures. But certain principles stayed rooted, passed down not through lectures, but through stories.
Young men ask elders why people don't cross lines like they used to.
The elders would shrug and say, because they remember what happened to the ones who thought time was a shield. They didn't always mention Bumpy's name. They didn't have to. When Bumpy Johnson's own time eventually came, as all men's does, his legacy wasn't confined to headlines or police files. It lived in unwritten rules, in unbroken windows, in conflicts that never reached violence because someone remembered how justice could arrive without warning. That night at Table 7 became part of that legacy, not for what was taken, but for what was restored. Balance, order, respect. Bumpy Johnson had shown Harlem that authority didn't belong to the loudest voice or the fastest hand. It belonged to the man who could carry the past without being consumed by it. The story endured because it spoke to something universal. Everyone, at some point, believes time will soften consequences. That distance will dull memory. That survival equals forgiveness. Bumpy Johnson proved otherwise. He showed that time wasn't an eraser, it was a mirror. And when you finally looked into it, you saw exactly who you'd been and who you'd become. In the end, that was Bumpy Johnson's greatest power. Not fear, not force, but memory, wielded with precision, patience, and restraint. Harlem didn't just remember him. Harlem learned from him. This wasn't just a story about a man who crossed Bumpy Johnson. It was a story about time and the lie people tell themselves about it. Time doesn't forgive. Time doesn't forget. Time doesn't choose sides. Time only waits. The man believed years would dull memory, that distance would turn betrayal into history. But Harlem knew better. And Bumpy Johnson knew best of all. Because real power doesn't rush to be seen. It allows mistakes to reveal themselves fully, then answers them completely. What happened wasn't revenge. It was correction. Bumpy Johnson didn't humiliate. He didn't overreach. He didn't need spectacle. He let a man face what he'd avoided and carry what he'd left behind. And in doing so, he reminded an entire community that justice doesn't always come loud, but it always comes exact. This moment wasn't about pride. It wasn't about dominance. It was about dignity. Harlem watched and understood. Respect isn't enforced through fear alone. It's enforced through consistency, memory, and the courage to hold people accountable without becoming cruel. That's why the story lasted. Because anyone can strike in anger. But only a legend can wait and still be right. In the end, the man didn't lose his life. He lost the lie he'd been living with. And Bumpy Johnson walked away having proven once again that real authority isn't about how fast you act. It's about how long your decisions stand. This wasn't just about one betrayal. It was about a community's order. And sometimes, it takes a legend, not to destroy a man, but to remind the world that time doesn't erase consequences. It delivers them. Exactly when they're due.